hello, everybody, and welcome back to our continuing coverage of MUFON Symposium here in Covington, Kentucky. We have with us right now Jim Lawrence. He is a UFO UAP investigator from New Brunswick, Canada. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. It was great to run into you. You've got some amazing cases here in the printout that you have been handing out to folks. How long have you been into UFO UAP research, Jim?
Well, if you want to go clear back, I got very interested in this subject when I was 12 years old. I grew up on a family farm, and my dad it was discussing an article. Near as I can tell, it was probably they had probably seen it in probably Men's True magazine. That's the only periodical I could think that was floating through the house at the time. And I was an avid reader from the time, even preschool. I remember trying to read Superman comics. I can hardly wait till I learn how to read so I can see what these things say. And so they were talking about this UFO case where the ladies, the bunch as I can remember of it, the lady had a UFO had stopped her car or something. She had heard a little bit of telepathic messages. And my dad and the other farmer were discussing. My dad just said, well, I don't have any problem with the idea of life in outer space and on other planets. And it would just kind of hit me like a paradigm shift. Wow, I never thought of that before. That is interesting. And then from there, I've read every available thing on the subject I find. Probably to date, I've read probably between 5,000 to 10,000 books on.
Wow.
And, and at first, when reading and going through high school, I was fascinated with science fiction. I read a lot of that. And then by the time I got to grade 12, I said, okay, no more fiction because truth is much stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
And so, and it didn't matter if I was reading true crime, spirituality. I researched acupuncture 5 years in probably 1970, 5 years before it was introduced into the U.S. And I remember I knew the mainstream medicine view on it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, 3,000-year-old medicine versus 200-year-old medicine?
Yeah.
This is a no-brainer. But anyway, it was another 5 years before that even caught up. So that's kind of how I got into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And now, what brought you to actual field investigation into UFO?
Well, that was a long process. I've been reading everything I get my hands on. And keep in mind, I was 12 years old then. I'm 66 years old now. But I never told a single soul till 2 years ago that I was interested locally, that I was interested in this subject. Because I have my own business. I still work every day. And I didn't, I didn't want to,
affect your business.
I didn't want to affect my business. I felt and it didn't matter if I was for me, it could be spirituality, it could be psychics, it could be any of those subjects. But ufology was always my favorite, and still is my favorite. And so that's kind of what. So from there, for years I was reading these. What happened was in our hometown when I was about 24 years old, Stanton Friedman was coming to our town to speak. So I remember looking at the newspaper and saying to my wife, I don't care what people think. I'm going to go see that. Because I was still worried about the stigma side.
Sure.
And I was worried about that till about 2 years ago. So anyway, so I'm standing in line. There's actually a fairly big crowd going this one evening, and I'm a little self-conscious. And I look over, hey, Fred, there's my accountant. Hey, how you doing? And hey, Sam, there's my electrician. Oh, I'm now more comfortable going.
Yeah.
And I'd already read many, many books on the subject, and I was blown away with Stanton about how normal he made it all sound and his depth of knowledge. Yeah. And so, and over the years and keep in mind, I only live an hour away from his hometown. And so that was where I first got to know Stan. But I never really knew him until about probably on a personal basis until about 5 years before he passed away. So that's kind of where I got started. After that, about probably 15 years ago, my wife actually got for my birthday a cruise. And I thought, oh, well, this is self-serving. My wife loves cruises. He says, no, read it. But it says, and it was a UFO cruise. First one ever. she found it on Stanton's website. So I really got to know Stanton really well on this what's called UFO cruise. Since then, we've done probably 5 or 6 of those. And about that time, probably about a few years before that, there was a MUFON conference in Vegas, and I had business on Vegas that weekend. So I told my wife, I said, I was still worried about the stigma, and I said, I don't care what people think about it, but I'm going to go to that because it was right there in that same time frame. And I was expecting people to, little propellers on their head, and weird people and so on. But I was blown away at the credibility of the people on the stage: astrophysicists, scientists, CEOs of hospitals, and but I did notice nobody under 50, because at that time it was a total career breaker.
Yeah.
And though, as you know, that's changed over time, particularly since 2017.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my background. Further into ufology, going to conferences and so on. It actually, about 4 or 5 years ago, my wife and daughter want to go shopping in another city. They want me to go with them. And for the weekend, I said, I hate shopping. I said, and then I come up with an idea. I think I'll just go to the airport, fly to Philadelphia to a MUFON boot camp for the weekend, and chat with some like-minded people there.
Yeah.
And it was on a whim. And then, so I went to it, had a great time. On the way back, I think, I could be a field investigator for New Brunswick, and I have to go through the whole MUFON thing. I thought, well, nobody's doing it in New Brunswick. I can be a field investigator. I'll just do the MUFON later. I'll just start. There's nobody doing it, and I'll just kind of put the word out. So the cases started coming in once I started telling people what I was doing.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow, incredible. And to know that, all of 2 years ago is when you kind of confronted this part of your life and brought it forward is incredible.
Yeah, and it's a funny thing about the stigma. And I've come to the conclusion that the stigma is 90% you and 10% them. There isn't as much stigma out there as most people think.
Sure.
What I've found, and I see about 10 new customers working every week, and at the end we were kind of relaxed. I bring it up to them, and I get their reactions. And the reality is, when I have that little handout that I do, and I even use it there, and I'll hand it to them. So about roughly 10 to 15% say, "Wow, this is cool. I'm not into this, but my husband is, or my brother-in-law is."
Yep.
And then there's about roughly 30% who say, "Whoa, that is interesting. I never really thought about it. But you're an interesting character." And that's okay. And then about 30%, "Oh, UFOs. No, who cares?
Yeah.
What's on the football game tonight?" And then there's really only about 1 to 2% says, "You're not going to get me to buy into that conspiracy thing." Yeah. And then that's the time you better come up with another subject.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I've been bringing up to numerous people. We have believers, non-believers that listen to this show, mainly because a lot of what we do is try to demystify topics. Try to cut through the conspiracy, things like that. And I have quite a cadre of listeners that are not in the UFOs or alien camp.
Yep.
And even my father being one of them. And like I've asked him, it's like, here's the way I explain it. Were you okay with Iran-Contra? Were you okay with the Pentagon Papers? Because apparently Grush is saying something much larger money-wise has been shifting around the back doors since 1939.
Exactly.
So are you cool with them spending your money that way? Because let's just talk about the accountability if you're not cool with the technology or the concept of aliens, and worry about where the money went.
Yeah, the one I bring up the mainstream sometime is, okay, let's talk about conspiracy theories. Obviously, I think most people know that the CIA invented that term to help push off the questions that are being asked about the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
And of course, they come up with the term conspiracy theory. But most people in the general public now agree there was more than one shooter. Now, there was only one shooter for a number of years when it was kind of contained. So I always kind of use that analogy that, okay, so your ideas have changed, and so that's kind of on the mainstream side before you get into this subject.
Yeah, most of the time I just go straight to the district attorney concept, and I'm like, if we don't have conspiracy theories, then we have a lot of district attorneys that need to not have a job.
That's right.
Because how are all these people convicted of conspiracy?
That's right. That's a good point.
They apparently had a conspiracy theory that they presented to the jury, and they bought it.
That's right.
So they are all conspiracy theorists, every one of them.
Okay. Yes.
But let's start cracking into a few of the cases that you have covered up there. I lived in Portland, Maine for many, many years. And,
cool.
That area right up there near Nova Scotia has numerous sightings, and especially USO sightings.
Yes, in Nova Scotia, because that's basically a water province. Halifax was there's a Shelburne naval base, and Halifax is a shipbuilding city.
Yeah.
And Chris Stiles has just brought out a new book about the Shag Harbor incident, and there's actually every year there's a Shag Harbor UFO Expo.
Oh, really?
And there's going to be one in sometime. Just Google Shag Harbor Expo there.
I am going to check that out.
And it's actually from this point on, right now we're in August. It's next month sometime.
Wow.
And I believe right now Nick Pope's going to be there. And let me see. They got a lineup. It's a weekend thing. It's a Saturday and a Sunday. And they got 2 or 3 other big names lined up. And I think Travis Walton's there this time too.
Oh, wow.
And Chris Stiles does a very, very good job in his presentation of the Shag Harbor crash. And and his findings are astounding.
Well, let's get into that a little bit. What was the Shag Harbor incident for all of our listeners that are not aware of it?
Well, okay, the Shag Harbor incident, it was for many years. It was first off, there was a crash in 1967, and a guy by the name of Laurie, who still there's a little kind of a very small UFO Shag Harbor museum. It's very, very small. It's only the room of a small size of a small bungalow. But he's about 80 some years old now, and he's actually the one who made the initial report to the RCMP, which is our national police.
Yep.
And so they all thought it was a downed airliner. So it got responded in normal terms, and it got into the public eye and into the investigation process as originally as a downed airliner. It became closer when all the fishermen went out to find it, and it obviously had it had yellow foam all around it, and it sunk below the water, and then it went out into the ocean. So over 40 years, Chris spent time investigating this. And so it became evident over time that it was actually a UFO, not an airliner. And so it became touted for many years as the most investigated by normal police event in the whole world. But as Chris was working on this case, and he wrote his first book on it, he kept hearing stories about something about UFO, 2 UFOs under the water, 2 alien beings on it trying to repair themselves. And he just thought it was a rumor. And then over time, actually what he actually found out, and he actually found some proof or indirect proof on the naval warship that was sitting over top that this actually did happen. But it wasn't Shag Harbor time. It was almost 10 years prior. So and it took him a long time to get this because these guys that he's interviewing has security clearance documents so anyway, that's his story. And he just brought out a book called I don't remember the name of it. Just go if you Google on Amazon Chris Stiles, and I think it's called Sweep 5 or something. And so the book just came out last month, and then Chris is going around speaking about it. So that's out of our province. The interesting thing for the UFO people that Stanton Friedman was a resident in New Brunswick, and Fredericton, New Brunswick is our capital. And as most people know, the Stanton Friedman passed away about 5 years ago. Yeah. But he had actually decided to, prior to that he would donate his files to the provincial archives. And so that all worked out, and much to our sadness, Stanton Friedman passed away, still working. He retired 3 times, but he was still working, and he passed away in an airport, I think in Toronto, on his way back. And then so you got to remember that when he was sending all his files to the provincial archives. Now you got to remember, our provincial archives only do corporate and finance. So they were blown away when 9 cargo vans of files showed up.
Wow.
And it was so massive. Grant Cameron out of Winnipeg, a very respected ufologist, and flew back and helped the provincial archives categorize it and do this and do that and do that and so on. So that was phase 1. Then I have a friend by the name of Hal Scarab who knew Stanton very, very well. And his background is military. He's written 22 books on the military. But I found out about accidentally a couple of years ago that he actually did a book on UFOs. So I said, well, I better get his book. And I read it, and I found it interesting. But as it turned out, Stanton, when he passed away and everything went to the archives, Hal knew Stanton really well, so he was good friends with Stanton and the family, and he was in the military, and he was actually in intelligence for the Canadian Army, and he actually spent his last 5 years of his career handling intelligence in Afghanistan. So that was his military background, and then he was on the board of directors for our local Fredericton Museum, and so being on the board of directors, he just was interested because he did displays for the museum to do, and his forte is actually World War I and World War II displays. And then he told me, well, it was a volunteer position. Pretty soon, this guy quits or this guy, passes away, and suddenly he is the head of the board of directors. So he come up with this idea just prior to COVID. He knew his wife, so he went to his wife and said, what are you doing with all the other stuff that Stanton had that didn't go to archives? She goes, it's still all in the basement. He said, what do you plan on doing with it? She said, well, I don't know. There was alien heads, and there was books that he did, and there was mementos he had. And
sure.
And she says, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. She says, this stuff's so weird. She says, I don't think people even buy it at a yard sale. She says, he says, well, how about we do this? He said, I'll take everything I want out of it, and we will do a couple rooms in our museum, 2 full rooms of Stanton Friedman stuff.
Epic.
And he says, and we'll run it for a year as commemoration to your, Stanton Friedman. We all love them. And then, when your daughters come back from the big city, they can stop in and look at it. They'll like it. Well, it turned out so well. It totally exceeded anything the university ever did, or the museum ever did. And so they didn't discontinue it after a year. They're moving into year 5, and there's no plans to ever discontinue it.
That is awesome to hear. And, just recently here in the last couple of years, Rice University has kind of done the same thing, starting up an archive of the anomalous. And my favorite thing is that it's being done by their religious studies department.
Yes, I watched a lot of their YouTube seminars.
Yeah. Yes. And how has, because of course the topic here in America and the attitude with our government is rapidly shifting in regards to UFO, UAP. How are things received in Canada?
I think it's pretty much the same. Like the Canadians know more about American news than the Americans know.
Yeah.
We joke around, maybe there's nothing else to do in Canada except, watch the American news. So, and we're very Americanized. The only thing is that with Canada, we're on the outside looking into the U.S. So most Canadians are not right or left when it comes to politics. They know the American
Sure.
politics, but they're going to look at the man to vote. They're not going to look at the political stripes. So, so I think we're pretty much equal on attitude and so on. On the record, the Canadian military and the Canadian police force don't really do much with the UFs. That's on the record. Though indications has always said, well, it's funny how, we have a case and it's a big case. The U.S. seems to know more about it or as much about it than we do. So anyway, back to cases that I know more
Yes,
about.
please.
You were asking earlier about some cases I've investigated. I've just kind of put the word out. I'm interested. Some people are coming to me. Sometimes it's customers. One of my favorite cases is these people are still living, and it's in my book. They're leaving the city of Fredericton, heading to back to St. John. And so I'm chatting with them. I'm talking to them about kitchens, and of course they know So then they suddenly, do you believe in UFOs? And so I could see what was coming, and I goes, no, I don't believe in UFOs. Belief constitutes faith. I know there's UFOs. And they go, oh, we got a story for you. And they both tell me this story. They're 70 years old, and they had left Fredericton, going back to St. John. They get by the Gagetown base. And he said, so what he was telling me, he says, first thing I noticed, we're driving, and I interrupt him. I said, I knew his kids were 25 and 30 years old and married. He had 2 boys. He'd already told me that. I said, do your kids believe in UFOs? Of course. They were in the back seat. So here we have 4 witnesses. The 2 boys are still living, and the husband and wife, and they're both standing there, the husband and wife. And he says, the first thing I noticed, we're driving along, all sound stopped. And then I look over to my left, and in behind the trees, about off the edge of the road, probably 100 feet away, there's literally a 3-story snow globe in behind the trees. 3 stories. And he says, the strange thing is, the light coming off it didn't look like any other light I've ever seen before or after. So he's saying, he says, we pulled over, we're looking at, I want to get out and go down and see what it's all about. And my wife won't let me out of the car. And she interrupts, of course you weren't getting out. You're going to leave me, and you disappeared, and I have to take the kids to the road, that sort of thing. And so she's interjecting into this story, which really adds confirmation that this is what they actually did see. And so I just found it, and I only know of all my research in the last 50 years, I only know of a couple other cases of a craft like that. And one was about roughly in the mid-50s in France. And so that was kind of an unusual sighting. Another one that's really interesting that I find is that we have a family friend. This was buried, and this is where I'm picking up a lot of the stories right now, is just a lot of cases I'm investigating right now is not so much current. They're 20, 25 years old. So this one's really interesting because there's a family friend who was best friends with my mother and father, and I knew him all the time he was growing up. So, and I'd heard a story that him and his wife had seen a UFO on a snowmobile. And so that's fine. And I'd been planning on, I knew where he lived, and I see him amongst the community. He's 82 years old, but he's just as sharp as a teenager. And so I hadn't got around to it, and he happened to be at the local store, and we're good friends. He's a real jokey type guy, and we're just chatting. And I said, what are you up to? And and then there's other people around. We know them all. And I said, Wayne, when I was a kid, I thought you were 100 years old then. Well, I got a big laugh, and that was fine. But I'm gauging the whole situation. And I'm seeing who's in the store, and when am I going to get a private mojo? So he steps outside the store, and he's heading to his car. And he goes, hey, and I step out, and the door's closed. There's nobody else around. I said, hey, Wayne, I got a question for you. And he turns around. I said, oh, well, what? And I says, tell me about the UFO you seen in 1967 over here by the Arnold Rockwell farm. And I said, you guys seen on the snowmobile. And he stopped right. I go, what? Man, that was a long time ago. He goes, oh, yeah. So he told me the whole story, And so this is a case of 25, 30 years old, floating around the family. The immediate family knew about it. He said, when he was telling me the story, he goes, was you talking to my wife? And I goes, no, I heard the story from your daughter. Oh, okay. So that is actually in my book. That one.
Wow.
So that's just that. And so if you ask people, there's sometimes those stories in families that even if you're close to it, you may not even know about it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, precisely. Right. And, you know, it's great to see so many people willing to come forward with their stories now. So many people who are emboldened with the current climate to come forward, share their experience, because as we've been saying with so many MUFON investigators, it's never too late to give your report. Frequently is the case that a report comes in 20, 30 years later and it confirms 2 other sightings that were already reported when it happened.
That's right.
So it's never too late to give your report to an investigator to follow up with things.
Absolutely.
Let everybody know where they can go to get your book, where they can go to join your social media, where they can go to keep up with all your research, and how to connect with you if they're in the New Brunswick area and have a sighting.
Well, on social media, I'm the chief administrator on this. It's called UFO NB. NB is for New Brunswick. And it's a closed group. You have to be invited to go on.
Okay.
And any articles that I do, or if I'm doing historical articles, I will put it on there first before I punch it out to the rest of the Facebooks.
All right.
And then on there, I do some slideshow presentations on the UFO subject in the Maritimes or around Canada, and I will be expanding that in the next year, and it will be on there. And if you're interested in a copy of this magazine, just contact me, and typically I'll just mail it out to you.
All right.
And so that's a couple ways to get a hold of me. And then occasionally I do public speaking at the Fredericton Museum too. To help support that museum.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
I
Nice
appreciate it, Jim. It's been great seeing you walk around and talk with folks about all your work. And thank you so much for making it out here to the MUFON Symposium.
It's been my pleasure.
Absolutely. While you were online checking out all of the amazing work of Jim Lawrence, make sure to stop on by CuriousRealm.com. CuriousRealm.com is where you can find all of the episodes. That's where you can like, follow, subscribe. Go find our YouTube channel, everything else. That's also where you can find CuriousRealm.com/store, where you can buy your copies of all of our guest books and other materials. Stay tuned through this commercial break. We will be right back with our continuing coverage of MUFON Symposium 2023 from Covington, Kentucky, right after this.